Chapter 3, Part 1 of Principia Ethica. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. Principia Ethica by G. E. Moore. Chapter 3, Hedonism. 36. In this chapter we have to deal with what is perhaps the most famous and the most widely held of all ethical principles, the principle that nothing is good but pleasure. My chief reason for treating of this principle in this place is, as I said, that hedonism appears in the main to be a form of naturalistic ethics. In other words, that pleasure has been so generally held to be the sole good is almost entirely due to the fact that it has seemed to be somehow involved in the definition of good, to be pointed out by the very meaning of the word. If this is so, then the prevalence of hedonism has been mainly due to what I have called a naturalistic fallacy, the failure to distinguish clearly that unique and indefinable quality which we mean by good. And that it is so we have very strong evidence in the fact that of all hedonistic writers Professor Sidgwick alone has clearly recognized that by good we do mean something unanalyzable, and has alone been led thereby to emphasize the fact that, if hedonism be true, its claims to be so must be rested solely on its self-evidence, that we must maintain pleasure is the sole good to be mere intuition. It appears to Professor Sidgwick as a new discovery that what he calls the method of intuitionism must be retained as valid alongside of, and indeed as the foundation of, what he calls the alternative methods of utilitarianism and egoism. And that it was a new discovery can hardly be doubted. In previous hedonists we find no clear and consistent recognition of the fact that their fundamental proposition involves the assumption that a certain unique predicate can be directly seen to belong to pleasure alone among existents. They do not emphasize, as they hardly have failed to have done had they perceived it, how utterly independent of all other truths this truth must be. Moreover, it is easy to see how this unique position should have been assigned to pleasure without any clear consciousness of the assumption involved. Hedonism is, for a sufficiently obvious reason, the first conclusion at which any one who begins to reflect upon ethics naturally arrives. It is very easy to notice the fact that we are pleased with things. The things we enjoy and the things we do not form two unmistakable classes, to which our attention is constantly directed. But it is comparatively difficult to distinguish the fact that we approve a thing from the fact that we are pleased with it. Although, if we look at the two states of mind, we must see that they are different, even though they generally go together. It is very difficult to see in what respect they are different, or that the difference can in any connection be of more importance than the many other differences, which are so patent and yet so difficult to analyze, between one kind of enjoyment and another. It is very difficult to see that by approving of a thing we mean feeling that it has a certain predicate. The predicate, namely, which defines the peculiar sphere of ethics, whereas in the enjoyment of a thing no such unique object of thought is involved. Nothing is more natural than the vulgar mistake which we find expressed in a recent book on ethics. The primary ethical fact is, we have said, that something is approved or disapproved, that is, in other words, the ideal representation of certain events in the way of sensation, perception, or idea is attended with a feeling of pleasure or of pain. In ordinary speech, I want this, I like this, I care about this are constantly used as equivalents for I think this good. And in this way it is very natural to be led to suppose that there is no distinct class of ethical judgments, but only the class things enjoyed, in spite of the fact, which is very clear, if not very common, that we do not always approve what we enjoy. It is of course very obvious from the opposition that I think this good is identical with I am pleased with this. It cannot be logically inferred that pleasure alone is good. But on the other hand, it is very difficult to see what could be logically inferred from such a supposition, and it seems natural enough that such an inference should suggest itself. A very little examination of what is commonly written on this subject will suffice to shew that a logical confusion of this nature is very common. Moreover, the very commission of the naturalistic fallacy involves that those who commit it should not recognize clearly the meaning of the proposition "this is good," that they should not be able to distinguish this from other propositions which seem to resemble it, and, where this is so, it is of course impossible that its logical relations should be clearly perceived. 37. There is, therefore, ample reason to suppose that hedonism is in general a form of naturalism, that its acceptance is generally due to the naturalistic fallacy. It is, indeed, only when we have detected this fallacy, when we have become clearly aware of the unique object which is meant by good, that we are able to give to hedonism the precise definition used above. Nothing is good but pleasure, and it may therefore be objected that, in attacking this doctrine under the name of hedonism, I am attacking a doctrine which has never really been held. But it is very common to hold a doctrine without being clearly aware what it is you hold. And though when hedonists argue in favor of what they call hedonism, I admit that, in order to suppose their arguments valid, they must have before their minds something other than the doctrine I have defined, yet, in order to draw the conclusions that they draw, it is necessary that they should also have before their minds this doctrine. In fact, my justification for supposing that I shall have refuted historical hedonism, if I refute the proposition "nothing is good but pleasure," is, that although hedonists have rarely stated their principle in this form, and though its truth in this form will certainly not follow from their arguments, yet their ethical method will follow logically from nothing else. Any pretense of hedonistic method to discover to us practical truths which we should not otherwise have known is founded on the principle that the course of action which will bring the greatest balance of pleasure is certainly the right one, and failing an absolute proof that the greatest balance of pleasure always coincides with the greatest balance of other goods, which it is not generally tempted to give, this principle can only be justified if pleasure be the sole good. Indeed, it can hardly be doubted that hedonists are distinguished by arguing, in disputed practical questions, as if pleasure were the sole good, and that it is justifiable, for this among other reasons, to take this as the ethical principle of hedonism will, I hope, be made further evident by the whole discussion of this chapter. By hedonism, then, I mean the doctrine that pleasure alone is good as an end, good in the sense which I have tried to point out as indefinable. The doctrine that pleasure, among other things, is good as an end is not hedonism, and I shall not dispute its truth. Nor again is the doctrine that other things beside pleasure are good as means at all inconsistent with hedonism. The hedonist is not bound to maintain that pleasure alone is good, if under good he includes, as we generally do, what is good as means to an end as well as the end itself. In attacking hedonism, I am therefore simply and solely attacking the doctrine that pleasure alone is good as an end or in itself. I am not attacking the doctrine that pleasure is good as an end or in itself, nor am I attacking any doctrine whatever as to what are the best means we can take in order to obtain pleasure or any other end. Hedonists do, in general, recommend a course of conduct which is very similar to that which I should recommend. I do not quarrel with them about most of their practical conclusions. I quarrel only with the reasons by which they seem to think their conclusions can be supported, and I do emphatically deny that the correctness of their conclusions is any ground for inferring the correctness of their principles. A correct conclusion may always be obtained by fallacious reasoning, and the good life or virtuous maxim of a hedonist affords absolutely no presumption that his ethical philosophy is also good. It is his ethical philosophy alone with which I am concerned. What I dispute is the excellence of his reasoning, not the excellence of his character as a man or even as a moral teacher. It may be thought that my contention is unimportant, but that is no ground for thinking that I am not in the right. What I am concerned with is knowledge only, that we should think correctly and so far arrive at some truth, however unimportant. I do not say that such knowledge will make us more useful members of society. If any one does not care for knowledge for its own sake, then I have nothing to say to him. Only it should not be thought that a lack of interest in what I have to say is any ground for holding it untrue. 38. Hedonists, then, hold that all other things but pleasure, whether conduct or virtue or knowledge, whether life or nature or beauty, are only good as means to pleasure or for the sake of pleasure, never for their own sakes or as ends in themselves. This view was held by Aristippus, the disciple of Socrates, and by the Cyreniaic school which he founded. It is associated with Epicurus and the Epicureans, and it has been held in modern times chiefly by those philosophers who call themselves utilitarians, by Bentham and by Mill, for instance. Herbert Spencer, as we have seen, also says that he holds it, and Professor Sidgwick, as we shall see, holds it too. Yet all these philosophers, as has been said, differ from one another more or less, both as what they mean by hedonism and as to the reason for which it is to be accepted as a true doctrine. The matter is therefore obviously not quite so simple as it might at first appear. My own object will be to shew quite clearly what the theory must imply, if it is made precise, if all confusions and inconsistencies are removed from the conception of it, and, when this is done, I think it will appear that all the various reasons given for holding it to be true are really quite inadequate, that they are not reasons for holding hedonism, but only for holding some other doctrine which is confused therewith. In order to attain this object I propose to take first Mill's doctrine, as set forth in his book called Utilitarianism. We shall find in Mill a conception of hedonism and arguments in its favour, which fairly represent those of a large class of hedonistic writers. To these representative conceptions and arguments grave objections which appear to me to be conclusive, have been urged by Professor Sidgwick. These I shall try to give in my own words, and shall then proceed to consider and refute Professor Sidgwick's own much more precise conceptions and arguments. With this, I think, we shall have traversed the whole field of hedonistic doctrine. It will appear from the discussion that the task of deciding what is or is not good in itself is by no means an easy one, and in this way the discussion will afford a good example of the method which it is necessary to pursue in attempting to arrive at the truth with regard to this primary class of ethical principles. In particular, it will appear that the two principles of method must be constantly kept in mind. 1. That the naturalistic fallacy must not be committed. 2. That a distinction between means and ends must be observed. 39. I propose, then, to begin by an examination of Mill's Utilitarianism. That is a book which contains an admirably clear and fair discussion of many ethical principles and methods. Mill exposes not a few simple mistakes which are very likely to be made by those who approach ethical problems without much previous reflection. But what I am concerned with is the mistakes which Mill himself appears to have made, and these only so far as they concern the hedonistic principles. Let me repeat what that principle is. It is, I have said, that pleasure is the only thing at which we ought to aim, the only thing that is good as an end and for its own sake. And now let us turn to Mill and see whether he accepts this description of the question at issue. Pleasure, he says at the outset, and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends. And again at the end of his argument, to think of an object as desirable unless for the sake of its consequences, and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing. These statements taken together, and apart from certain confusions which are obvious in them, seem to imply the principle I have stated. And if I succeed in shewing that Mill's reason for them do not prove them, it must at least be admitted that I have not been fighting with shadows or demolishing a man of straw. It will be observed that Mill adds absence of pain to pleasure in his first statement, though not in his second. There is in this a confusion with which, however, we need not deal. I shall talk of pleasure alone for the sake of conciseness, but all my arguments will apply a fortiori to absence of pain. It is easy to make the necessary substitutions. Mill holds then that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. Happiness he has already defined as pleasure and the absence of pain. He does not pretend that this is more than an arbitrary verbal definition, and, as such, I have not a word to say against it. His principle, then, is pleasure is the only thing desirable, if I may be allowed when I say pleasure to include in that word, so far as necessary, absence of pain. And now what are his reasons for holding that principle to be true? He has already told us that questions of ultimate ends are not amendable to direct proof. Whatever can be proved to be good must be so by being shewn to be a means to something admitted to be a good without proof. With this I perfectly agree. Indeed, the chief object of my first chapter was to shew that this is so. Anything which is good as an end must be admitted to be good without proof. We are agreed so far. Mill even uses the same examples which I used in my second chapter. How, he says, is it possible to prove that health is good? What proof is it possible to give that pleasure is good? Well, in chapter 4, in which he deals with the proof of his utilitarian principle, Mill repeats the above statements in these words. It has already, he says, been remarked that questions of ultimate ends do not admit of proof in the ordinary acception of the term. Questions about ends, he goes on in this same passage, are, in other words, questions what things are desirable. I am quoting these repetitions because they make it plain what otherwise might have been doubted, that Mill is using the words desirable or desirable as an end as absolute and precisely equivalent to the words good as an end. We are, then, now to hear what reasons he advances for this doctrine that pleasure alone is good as an end. 40. Questions about ends, he says, are, in other words, questions about what things are desirable. The utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. What ought to be required of this doctrine, what conditions is it requisite that the doctrine should fulfill, to make good its claim to be believed? The only proof capable of being given that a thing is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it, and so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. This, however, being the fact, we have not only all the proof which the case admits of, but all which it is possible to require, that happiness is a good. That each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. Happiness has made out its title as one of the ends of conduct, and consequently one of the criteria of morality. There, that is enough. That is my first point. Mill has made as naive and artless a use of the naturalistic fallacy as anybody could desire. Good, he tells us, means desirable, and you can only find out what is desirable by seeking to find out what is actually desired. This is, of course, only one step towards the proof of hedonism, for it may be, as Mill goes on to say, that other things beside pleasure are desired. Whether or not pleasure is the only thing desired is, as Mill himself admits, a psychological question, to which we shall presently proceed. The important step for ethics is this one just taken, the step which pretends to prove that good means desired. Well, the fallacy in this step is so obvious that it is quite wonderful how Mill failed to see it. The fact is that desirable does not mean able to be desired, or visible means able to be seen. The desirable means simply what ought to be desired or deserves to be desired, just as the detestable means not what can be but what ought to be detested, and the damnable what deserves to be damned. Mill has, then, smuggled in, under cover of the word desirable, the very notion about which he ought to be quite clear. Desirable does indeed mean what it is good to desire, but when this is understood, it is no longer plausible to say that our only test of that is what is actually desired. Is it merely a tautology when the prayer book talks of good desires? Are not bad desires also possible? Nay, we find Mill himself talking of a better and nobler object of desire, as if, after all, what is desired were not ipso facto good, and good in proportion to the amount it is desired. Moreover, if the desired is ipso facto the good, then the good is ipso facto the motive of our actions, and there can be no question of finding motives for doing it, as Mill is at such pains to do. If Mill's explanation of desirable be true, then his statement that the rule of action may be confounded with the motive of it is untrue. For the motive of action will then be according to him ipso facto its rule. There can be no distinction between the two, and therefore no confusion, and thus he has contradicted himself flatly. These are specimens of the contradictions which, as I have tried to shew, must always follow from the use of the naturalistic fallacy, and I hope I need now say no more about the matter. 41. Well, then, the first step by which Mill has attempted to establish his hedonism is simply fallacious. He has attempted to establish the identity of the good with the desired by confusing the proper sense of desirable, in which it denotes that which it is good to desire, with the sense which it would bear if it were analogous to such words as visible. If desirable is to be identical with good, then it must bear one sense, and if it is to be identical with desired, then it must bear quite another sense. And yet to Mill's contention that the desired is necessarily good, it is quite essential that these two senses of desirable should be the same. If he holds they are the same, then he has contradicted himself elsewhere. If he holds that they are not the same, then the first step in his proof of hedonism is absolutely worthless. But now we must deal with the second step. Having proved, as he thinks, that the good means the desired, Mill recognizes that if he is further to maintain that pleasure alone is good, he must prove that pleasure alone is really desired. This doctrine, that pleasure alone is the object of all our desires, is the doctrine which Professor Sidgwick has called psychological hedonism, and it is a doctrine which most evident psychologists are now agreed in rejecting. But it is a necessary step in the proof of any such naturalistic hedonism as Mill's, and it is so commonly held by people not expert either in psychology or in philosophy that I wish to treat it at some length. It will be seen that Mill does not hold it in its bare form. He admits that other things than pleasure are desired, and this admission is at once a contradiction of his hedonism. One of the shifts by which he seeks to evade this contradiction we shall afterwards consider, but some may think that no such shifts are needed. They may say of Mill what Callicles says of Polus in the Gorgias, that he has made the fatal admission through a most unworthy fear of appearing paradoxical, that they, on the other hand, will have the courage of their convictions and will not be ashamed to go to any lengths of paradox in defense of what they hold to be the truth. 42. Well, then, we are supposing it held that pleasure is the object of all desire, that it is the universal end of all human activity. Now I suppose it will not be denied that people are commonly said to desire other things. For instance, we usually talk of desiring food and drink, of desiring money, approbation, fame. The question then must be of what is meant by desire, and by the object of desire. There is obviously asserted some sort of necessary or universal relation between something which is called desire and another thing which is called pleasure. The question is of what sort this relation is. Whether in conjunction with the naturalistic fallacy above mentioned it will justify hedonism. Now I am not prepared to deny that there is some universal relation between pleasure and desire, but I hope to shew that if there is, it is of such sort as will rather make against than for hedonism. It is urged that pleasure is always the object of desire, and I am ready to admit that pleasure is always, in part at least, the cause of desire. But this distinction is very important. Both views might be expressed in the same language. Both might be said to hold that whenever we desire, we always desire because of some pleasure. If I asked my supposed hedonist, "Why do you desire that?" he might answer, quite consistently with his contention, "Because there is pleasure there." And if he is asked me the same question, I might answer, equally consistently with my contention, "Because there is pleasure here." Only our two answers will not mean the same thing. It is this use of the same language to denote quite different facts which I believe to be the chief cause why psychological hedonism is so often held, just as it was also the cause of Mill's naturalistic fallacy. Let us try to analyze the psychological state which is called desire. That name is usually confined to a state of mind in which the idea of some object or event not yet existing is present to us. Suppose, for instance, I am desiring a glass of port wine. I have the idea of drinking such a glass before my mind, although I am not yet drinking it. Well, how does pleasure enter into this relation? My theory is that it enters in this way. The idea of drinking causes a feeling of pleasure in my mind which helps to produce that state of incipient activity which is called desire. It is therefore because of a pleasure which I already have, the pleasure excited by a mere idea, that I desire the wine which I have not. And I am ready to admit that a pleasure of this kind, an actual pleasure, is always among the causes of every desire, and not only of every desire, but of every mental activity, whether conscious or subconscious. I am ready to admit this, I say. I cannot vouch that it is the true psychological doctrine, but, at all events, it is not prima facie quite absurd. And now, what is the other doctrine? The doctrine which I am supposing held, and which is at all events essential to Mill's argument. It is this: that when I desire the wine, it is not the wine which I desire, but the pleasure which I expect to get from it. In other words, the doctrine is that the idea of a pleasure not actual is always necessary to cause desire. It is these two different theories which I suppose the psychological hedonists to confuse. The confusion is, as Mr. Bradley puts it, between a pleasant thought and the thought of a pleasure. It is in fact only where the latter, the thought of a pleasure, is present, that pleasure can be said to be the object of desire, or the motive to action. On the other hand, when only a pleasant thought is present, as, I admit, may always be the case, then it is the object of the thought, that which we are thinking about, which is the object of desire and the motive to action. And the pleasure which that thought excites may indeed cause our desire or move us to action, but it is not our end or object, nor our motive. Well, I hope this distinction is sufficiently clear. Now let us see how it bears upon ethical hedonism. I assume it to be perfectly obvious that the idea of the object of desire is not always and only the idea of a pleasure. In the first place, plainly, we are not always conscious of expecting pleasure when we desire a thing. We may be only conscious of the thing which we desire, and may be impelled to make it at once, without any calculation as to whether it will bring us pleasure or pain. And, in the second place, even when we do expect pleasure, it can certainly be very rarely pleasure only which we desire. For instance, granted that, when I desire my glass of port wine, I have also an idea of the pleasure I expect from it, plainly that pleasure cannot be the only object of my desire. The port wine must be included in my object, else I might be led by my desire to take wormwood instead of wine. If the desire were directed solely towards the pleasure, it could not lead me to take the wine. If it is to take a definite direction, it is absolutely necessary that the idea of the object from which the pleasure is expected should also be present and should control my activity. The theory, then, that what is desired is always and only pleasure must break down. It is impossible to prove that pleasure alone is good, by that line of argument. But if we substitute for this theory that other, possibly true theory, that pleasure is always the cause of desire, then all the plausibility of our ethical doctrine that pleasure alone is good straightway disappears. For in this case, pleasure is not what I desire, it is not what I want, it is something which I already have, before I can want something. And can anyone feel inclined to maintain that that which I already have, while I am still desiring something else, is always and alone the good? End of chapter 3, part 1.